Mexico's most powerful drug kingpin was killed during a military operation. Mexican officials say criminal groups burned cars and trucks to block roads across the country. The State Department is warning Americans to shelter in place. ABC's Melissa Dunn is near the border tonight.
Explosions erupting across Puerto Vallarta tonight. Black smoke seen rising over the resort city on Mexico's Pacific coast. Mexico's military forces launching a daring operation to capture cartel leader Ruben N., known as El Mencho.
February 22nd, 2026, Amicio Arcegara Cervantes, known as El Mencho, was killed in a Mexican military operation in Talpala, Jalisco. El Mencho's death immediately triggered widespread violence and destruction, resulting in the deaths of dozens of people, mainly cartel members and security forces. Now, El Mencho, a former police officer turned cartel leader, actually spent some time in the United States and was arrested on multiple occasions. In 1986, he was arrested in San Francisco, California, for stolen property and carrying a loaded gun. In 1989, he was arrested again in San Francisco for selling narcotics. He was then deported back to Mexico, and according to border entry records, El Mencho crossed the U.S.-Mexico border several times during the late 80s under different aliases, and the DA believed it was at this time was when he became involved in the drug trade heavily. Now that El Mencho is gone, what next? And in my personal opinion, nothing.
Nothing?
Yeah, nothing. Now why would I say that? Let me explain. In 2016, El Chapo Guzman was recaptured after busting out of jail before, but this time, again, recaptured. He was the leader of the Sinaloa cartel. As we all know, the Sinaloa wasn't dismantled. Leadership was just transitioned over to Ismael Zambada, aka El Mayo, who was eventually arrested in El Paso, Texas in 2024 after he was tricked into boarding a plane that he thought was going to southern Mexico, but instead headed straight for Texas. And it was said Joaquin Guzman Lopez, one of the sons of El Chapo Guzman and the leader of the Los Chapitos, a faction of the Sinaloa cartel, is who betrayed El Mayo, convincing him to get on a plane that he thought was going to Culiacan, Mexico. Now, when these two cartel leaders were taken into custody and removed from leadership, do you think it had that much of an effect on the Sinaloa cartel or the drug flow into the United States as a whole? In 2016 and 17, after El Chapo was arrested, prosecutors quoted as saying, El Chapo's downfall hasn't reduced the availability, price, use, or lethality of current illegal drugs. The National Institute on Drug Abuse stated that daily marijuana use amongst teenagers remains steady. Overdose deaths, prescription drug use, and illicit drug use rose dramatically in 2016 and 17. And when it came to El Mayo, in 2024, experts wasted no time in stating that his capture isn't going to stop anything. Now, in El Mencho's case, I don't know why anybody would think anything would be any different. Hell, El Mencho haven't even been dead 3 days before there was already talks about somebody else taking control of the CJNG, the abbreviation for the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, who El Mencho was the undisputed leader of. A young man by the name of El Yogurt is who people are already saying is supposed to take charge of the CJNG. How true that is, nobody truly knows, because the death of El Mencho is still very fresh. Now, research has shown over $100 billion in drugs are trafficked into the United States every year. You see, my question is, do you believe that America really doesn't have the means to stop all that drugs from entering into the United States? Here are some facts for you. The United States of America consumes more drugs than any other country on the planet. It also has the most drug overdoses on the planet, not surprisingly. Now, with this being understood, there is obviously a massive demand for drugs in America. Always has been. See, while President Donald Trump was willing to send U.S. troops to Mexico to combat these so-called evil cartel members,
seen as foreign terror organizations, would you think about ordering U.S. Special Forces into Mexico to take them out?
Could happen. Stranger things have happened.
ironically, some of our very troops were involved in that evil right on U.S. soil. August 2023, Kenneth Maurice Quick, who's from Laurinburg, North Carolina, was charged with murder, conspiracy to distribute, and possession with the intent to distribute cocaine, firearm and obstruction charges, and 2 counts of the use of a firearm causing death. Now, who were the victims? 37-year-old Massant William Levine and 44-year-old Timothy Dumas, who both weren't exactly innocent. William Levine, in 2018, had actually shot dead first on Mark Leshiker. The official report stated that Mark Leshiker charged at Levine with a screwdriver after they had an argument. Levine was forced to defend himself, and Levine, around the time of his death, he was actually supposed to appear in court for a hit-and-run charge. Dumas was supposed to appear in court himself around the time of his death for breaking and entering, communicating threats, and impersonating a law enforcement officer, for allegedly breaking into an apartment with the intent to terrorize and injure an occupant of the building. Now, hit and run, breaking and entering, shooting somebody dead, self-defense or not, these two dudes clearly had a lot going on. And for both of them to turn up dead at the same time, that's not a coincidence. Now the question was, what the hell did they have going on? Well, meet Seth Harp, an investigative reporter who made it his business to investigate this Fort Bragg incident.
Well, Trump says he wants to deploy military forces to countries like Mexico to crack down on drug cartels there. But I think he should look closer to home, because there's at least 14 cases that I'm tracking of Fort Bragg trained soldiers who have been either arrested, apprehended, or killed in the course of trafficking drugs in the last 5 years or so, often in conjunction with those very same Mexican drug cartels. In December of 2020, two dead bodies were found on a remote training range at Fort Bragg. One of them was a member of Delta Force. They had both been shot to death. And the limited information from police at that time was that it was believed to be a double homicide from a drug deal gone wrong. The other person who was killed at that time was Timothy Dumas, who was a support officer, a logistics officer for JSOC. The other one, the Delta Force operator, his name was Billy Levine. I did learn in the course of researching the book and reporting it that Levine and Dumas were buying cocaine through the Los Zetas cartel in Mexico, which in fact was trained in the United States. It began as a project, a joint project between the U.S. Special Forces and the Mexican government to create an elite paratrooper unit of the Mexican Army, and later went rogue and became one of the most feared cartels in Mexico.
He even has a book named the Fort Bragg Cartel. Now, the Mexican Airborne Special Forces Group, the GAFE, is an elite unit of the Mexican military that was formed in 1986. By the 1990s, from 96 to 99, around 500 GAFE members received training from the U.S. 7 Special Forces Group, Delta Force, with their focus being unconventional warfare, counterinsurgency, and counterterrorism in Latin America. They also got training in what they call anti-narcotics tactics, whatever the hell that is. Now in Mexico, there was a cartel called the Gulf Cartel. It was taken over by an individual by the name of Ociel Cardenas Guellin, who was actually fighting multiple cartels at once. Guellin recruited 30 members of the GAFE who were trained in Fort Bragg to become his personal bodyguards, enforcers, and combat mercenaries, which really wasn't hard for him to do, considering that the cartel pays better than the Mexican military. Guellin would eventually be captured and extradited to the United States. Now the enforcement arm of the Gulf Cartel was the Zetas. But with Guellin gone, there was now a power vacuum, and the Zetas and those same American-trained men would break off from the Gulf Cartel and not just challenge the Gulf Cartel itself, but every cartel, and with deadly efficiency. The Zetas, at their height, was considered the most deadly and brutal drug cartel in Mexico at that time. Now, to be fair to the United States, their intention wasn't exactly to train a bunch of men that would go on to become some of the most vicious drug traffickers in Mexico. The Zetas did go on to become a problem for the United States by trafficking drugs into the country, human smuggling, and money laundering, which is a tale as old as time. Like I've mentioned before, in the first video I ever posted on this channel, the United States has always had a funny way of creating future problems. Ever heard of Kun Sa, the Opium King? This guy is from Burma, officially named Myanmar. It's in Southeast Asia. From 1974 to 1994, he controlled what was called the Golden Triangle, one of the largest opium producing areas on the planet since the 1950s. At his peak, Kun Sa controlled over 70% of the opium production in Burma, and he was also responsible for up to 45% of the opium coming into the United States. At one point, Kun Sa was part of a nationalist army that was the remnants of Chiang Kai-shek's army, 12,000 soldiers who were basically stranded in the bushes after Mao Zedong communists seized power in China in 1949. Kun Sa was only a teenager at this time, This stranded army was called the Kuomintang, KMT for short. That's the abbreviation. But while the KMT was in this region, take a wild guess who funded them and trained them.
I wonder.
If you guessed the CIA, you guessed right. The CIA funded and trained the KMT. And while they were doing that, Kun Sa, a teenage boy at the time, soaked up everything. The CIA also laid the groundwork and the networks throughout that region that Kun Sa himself would come to use years later. And he would eventually flood American streets with opium. Kun Sa was actually able to dodge extradition, and he died of natural causes in 2007 as an old man with a whole lot of money. May 24, 2010, Tivoli Gardens, Jamaica. A major security operation was launched to apprehend Christopher Dutters Coke, the undisputed leader of a notorious gang named the Shower Posse. The United States wanted him extradited. It was a 4-day gun battle that resulted in over 70 civilian deaths. Now, Dutters was wanted for drug trafficking and firearm offenses. The Shower Posse has been operating heavily in the United States for years. And in 2000, the ATF and prosecutors believed that the Shower Posse was responsible for more than 1,400 slayings in several states all across the United States, over the span of like 10 to 15 years. Now, the history of the Shower Posse is long and extensive and very interesting to say the least, but I'm gonna give you the short version. In Jamaica, there are two main political parties: the Jamaican Labour Party, the JLP, and the People's National Party, PNP. Now, the PNP party, they embrace socialism, having close ties to Cuba, and that didn't exactly sit well with the Reagan administration. So Ronald Reagan, the president of the United States at the time, the CIA, they supported Edward Seaga, the leader of the JLP party, the opposing party. The CIA funded the JLP party with arms and ammunition. Now in Jamaica, a lot of the supporters are not just regular civilians. A lot of them are gang members. Now these gangs back in the JLP party that's funded by the CIA now had guns and ammunition. And the main gang that was working on behalf of the JLP, they were called the Phoenix Gang, led by a man by the name of Claude Mossop. Just follow me here. Mossop's Phoenix Gang would eventually morph into the Shower Posse, and Mossop himself would be killed. And a man by the name of Lester Lloyd Coke is who would take over the Shower Posse. His alias was Jim Brown, and he would run the Shower Posse with an iron goddamn fist. Now fast forward years later, as Jim Brown and the Shower Posse, they're doing their thing, the United States of America would then request for his arrest and extradition, and he would be arrested. But he wouldn't even make it to the extradition part, because while awaiting extradition, his cell would accidentally catch on fire. Killing Jim Brown. Now after the death of Jim Brown, whose real name is Lester Lloyd Coke, his son, Christopher Dutters Coke, would take on the reins, and he would actually make the Shower Posse, turn the Shower Posse into the international beast that it became, flooding American streets with drugs and bloodshed, leading to the 2010 incursion, where they had to go down there and capture him. Unlike his father, he would actually make it to the United States and face justice. Now, the Shower Posse was a brutal and vicious gang without a doubt, but you can't speak about the Shower Posse or the history of the Shower Posse without bringing up the United States. America 100% played a big part in the Shower Posse becoming who they became. And again, it came back and bite America in the ass. Take a look in the Middle East in the 1980s. The United States funded the Mujahideen so they can fight against the Soviets who was occupying Afghanistan at the time. Now, this move by the United States was to stop Soviet influence in the region. And what it did was also empower the Mujahideen. Now, fast forward, and you couple that with the Iraqi invasion, where murder, torture, and sheer chaos took place, and the United States also make it their business to disband the Iraqi army, leaving over 400,000 soldiers and security personnel out of work. These circumstances pushed a lot of men into the arms of radical groups that were going to be infamously known across the globe, such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Fun fact, some of the most high-ranking members of ISIS were actually in Saddam Hussein's former army. Now let's bring it back close to America. In LA, in the 1980s, the Mara Salvatrucha gang, MS-13, was born. Now the gang was born in the US, as we all know. But when you look at the origin, what led to the gang being formed in the United States, we gotta go back to El Salvador. From 1980 to 1990, the United States provided over $1 billion in military assistance to El Salvador and about $900 million for military education and training as well. And some of these American-trained Salvadorian military members would carry out brutal acts of violence, like the El Mozati massacre, one of the worst massacres in Latin American history. Men, women, and children were rounded up and slaughtered. The death toll was believed to get up to like 1,000 people. Now you would ask why? Why would America back a militia that would carry out such an act? Well, it was because of the fact that America didn't like that a lot of El Salvadorians were influenced by liberation theology. It was an international movement which combines Catholicism, that if that's how you say it, Catholicism, with left-wing politics, basically communism. This led the Salvadorian government to target majority Catholic villages, priests, nuns, and other Catholic activists. And this is what led to the El Mozete massacre, because people in that town were doing business with and related to the Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, the FMLN. That was the name of the movement America was threatened by. Now this led to thousands of Salvadorians being misplaced and becoming refugees, and a lot of them settled in good old United States in and around Los Angeles. The MS-13 was formed by a bunch of teenagers. Now as soon as the war was done, America wasted no time in mass deportations. They sent thousands of vicious gang members right back, a lot of them raised in the United States, English being their main language, heading back to a country they're not familiar with. El Salvador didn't really have much of a gang problem until the mass deportation in the 90s. El Salvador is doing a whole lot better now because of the drastic measures it took in the past couple years. But before it got to that point, it was horrible. And America again played a role. Now why is all of this important when it comes to the El Mencho story? Well, these examples prove that America, at minimum, helped create their own problems, like I said. Do you think the drugs that are coming into the United States and the violence and destruction that comes with it is solely Mexico's fault? Not only does America have the largest demand for drugs than any other country on the planet, guess what else America is known for besides drug use?
Say hello to my little friend!
Guns. Lots and lots of guns. America is literally the most armed country on the planet, not only military-wise, but as far as civilian gun ownership. For every 100 people, there are 120 guns. That's enough guns to arm every man, woman, and child, and still have some left over. Mexico reported that 80% of weapons seized in its country at one point came from the United States. As a matter of fact, in 2025, just last year, America's Supreme Court blocked a lawsuit filed by Mexico against U.S. gun makers, accusing them of helping fuel cartel violence in the country. You have thousands of guns being smuggled into Mexico every year, and they are being used for some of the worst crimes imaginable. Now, I want you to ask yourself, who's being held accountable for that? Who's allowing that to happen? And what does America plan on doing about that? And I could answer that for you. No one is being held accountable. America doesn't give a shit, and America don't plan on doing anything about it. It's only an issue when we start talking about the El Menchos of the world. You see, this idea that Mexico's cartel problem is solely a Mexican problem is simply not true, or that the Mexicans are just at fault. Again, not true. America and Mexico are a lot closer than people think, politically and socially. What happens in America on a massive scale affects Mexico, and vice versa. Once the guns keep flowing into Mexico and America maintains its massive appetite for drugs, nothing is ever going to change south of the border. And whether it's El Chapo, El Mayo, El Mencho, El Yogurt, or El 03, the game and the system is going to remain the same. Ain't shit gonna change. Stay dangerous, people. Till next time.
Stranger things have happened.